Performing your best in a test-taking situation has to do not only with how much you know, but also with how strategically you take your exam. It can be difficult to stay focused on the content if you're worried about the clock. Fortunately, there's a number of ways that you can avoid the time crunch by being intentional about your time. One way to think about it is as a budget. And so you have a certain number of minutes and you want to allot them as well as you can. One way to build your confidence from the beginning and to build up a reserve of time is to focus on the easiest or the quickest questions or sections of the exam. So rather than worrying about the ones that you're skipping through to begin with, see if you can just focus on answering the questions that you know. And as you're going, keep moving. If you find that you're on a question and you read it and you're stuck, skip the question. And an idea to think about here is the 5-second rule. If you've ever applied this to food, it's the idea of you drop something on the floor and you have about 5 seconds, and if you're within that 5-second period, you can still reclaim the food. All is not lost. If it's longer than that, though, you just gotta let it go. Now, this isn't to say that on an exam you're not coming back to the question. However, you don't want to get stuck and spin your wheels and then start to worry that you're losing time and you aren't able to get to the other questions. So if you keep moving and return to the skipped items later, what you have left is a stockpile of time for all the more difficult questions. So here's an example of how it might play out. Let's say you have 60 minutes and 40 questions. If there's about 30 of those that are fairly easy and it takes 1 minute to answer each of them, you have 30 minutes remaining. Let's say that you left about 5 of the questions that were medium in terms of difficulty, and you want to go ahead and allot about 2 minutes each, no problem. You'll then have 20 minutes remaining. With these minutes, let's say there's 5 really difficult questions that you left. Fortunately, you have 4 minutes for each of them. If you were to take 4 minutes on these up front, there's no telling if you would have gotten to those easier questions that might be hidden toward the end. It's likely that if you are going through the exam and starting with the easy things and skipping the ones you don't know, ultimately you're going to have some questions that either you completely skipped or that you put in a tentative answer to, but you're not quite sure if that's correct. So you're probably going back to those at some point. And one tip that you might use if you're not certain is to try to compare questions on the same topic. Often those might have some cues or some hints or some details even within the question itself that help provide a definition or an answer to what you're seeking for a different question. If you're between two answers, a phrase that might pop into your head is, what if? What if the professor really meant it this way? Or what if in an alternate universe everything were to come together in a certain way? Would the answer then be D? And the problem with this is that although it seems like all of a sudden you're thinking critically and you're having these great insights, often it's the case that it's just your anxiety talking. And so if you can learn to recognize that and tell yourself, don't really change the answer unless you're certain, that can keep you from being in a situation where you had it correct and then you changed it. Of course, sometimes there's legitimate situations where you do want to change your answer. That's okay, but you want to apply these logically. So here are some key criteria. Try not to go beyond them. So 1, let's say you miscalculated. You didn't carry the 1 in a problem-solving situation. Of course, you want to go ahead and change your answer. Also, if you misread it, perhaps you didn't see the word not, but now you do. Again, it's probably a different answer. And then finally, if as you were going through the exam, you remembered something or you saw something in a different question that helped you to realize that you had been incorrect, well, that might change your answer as well. You also want to have strategies for answering questions as accurately as you can. But you can't necessarily do that if you're worrying about the things that you studied that you don't want to forget and that might possibly come up on the exam. So if you take about 1 or 2 minutes at the beginning to do what's known as a memory dump, and you put down the key terms or mnemonic devices that you wanted to make sure you didn't forget, you can rest assured knowing that those are written down somewhere. They're there if you need them. But what you can focus on is each question that you actually encounter as it comes up. Another important thing with interpreting what you're being asked to do in a question is to make sure that you're not led astray by distractors or even just very lengthy questions. And so consider what is given to you by the question, information that you need in order to answer it, so whether important details or things that set up the context, but also what you're asked to find. If you're being asked to solve for y, for instance, don't respond with what x is. Another thing that can completely change what the question is asking, or that might just qualify it, are words that indicate that something is absolute or negative. Typically, when we're reading, we keep an eye out for these words, but under an exam situation, it's not the same as typical reading, and so it can be difficult to actually see these words and be aware of them. One of the most effective habits that you can develop is to underline and circle keywords such as these or any other important information that you find in your question stems or your answer choices. For more information, not just on test-taking strategies, but also strategies for preparing for exams and studying effectively, visit the Dennis Learning Center website, or if you're on campus, feel free to visit us.